The fluorescent lights in Riverside County Family Court buzzed overhead as I watched my ex-husband's attorney rise from her chair with the kind of confidence that only comes from expensive suits and hourly rates I could never afford. Rebecca. Collins adjusted her designer glasses and turned toward Judge Martinez with a smile that made my stomach twist into knots. I gripped the edge of my plastic chair so hard my knuckles went white, trying to steady myself for what I knew was coming. "Your Honor," Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the small courtroom like she was giving a presentation to a boardroom full of executives, "my client, Michael Thompson, is deeply concerned about his children's well-being under their mother's care. Sarah Thompson has consistently demonstrated a pattern of medical neglect that puts both Jake and Emma at serious risk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Medical neglect. The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to stand up and scream that it wasn't true, that I'd spent countless nights checking Jake's breathing when his asthma flared up, that I'd memorized every ingredient label to avoid Emma's allergy triggers, that I'd worked extra shifts just to afford their medications. But my court-appointed advocate, Lisa Chen, had warned me to stay quiet unless asked. To speak directly, "She fails to maintain proper medical schedules," Rebecca continued, pulling out a thick manila folder that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "The children miss doctor appointments. Their medications run out. Jake's asthma inhaler was empty for 3 days last month because she forgot to refill it. Emma broke out in hives twice this fall because Sarah didn't properly manage her food allergies. This isn't about money, Your Honor. This is about basic parental responsibility." Each sentence felt like another weight being placed on my chest. I could feel the judge's eyes on me, measuring, evaluating, probably wondering how a mother could be so careless with her own children's health. What she didn't know, what nobody in this sterile courtroom understood, was that those 3 days without Jake's inhaler happened because the pharmacy was closed during my lunch break, and I couldn't leave work early without losing pay we desperately needed. The hives Emma got were from a school snack I didn't know about until it was too late, not from my negligence. My name is Sarah Thompson, and 6 months ago I thought I was going to lose my children forever because their father convinced a courtroom full of strangers that I was an unfit mother. I'm sharing this story because I want every parent out there who's ever felt overwhelmed, who's ever felt like they weren't enough, to know that sometimes the truth has a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Rebecca Collins dissect every imperfect moment of my parenting, I felt smaller than I had in years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman trying to paint me as medically negligent was someone who probably paid other people to remember her own children's birthdays. But in family court, perception matters more than reality, and Michael had always been better at controlling perception than I was. I watched him sitting next to his lawyer, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his hands folded calmly in his lap like he was attending a business meeting rather than fighting for custody of his own children. Michael had this way of looking completely reasonable, even when he was being completely unreasonable. A skill that had served him well during our marriage and was serving him even better during our divorce. The worst part was seeing Jake and Emma sitting in the front row behind Michael, dressed in clothes I'd never seen before. Jake was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look like a miniature businessman, while Emma had on a pink dress with white tights that probably cost more than our grocery budget for a week. They looked uncomfortable, like they were playing dress-up in someone else's life, but they also looked healthy and clean and well cared for, which I knew was exactly the point. Rebecca Collins was still talking, her voice rising and falling, with practiced dramatic effect. Mr. Thompson has documented numerous instances where his children have returned from their mother's home showing signs of medical distress. Jake's inhaler usage has increased significantly when he's with her. Emma has complained of feeling sick after eating at Sarah's apartment. These aren't isolated incidents, Your Honor. This is a pattern of neglect that could have serious long-term consequences for these children's health and development. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to remember how I'd gotten here. 2 years ago, I was Sarah Martinez, a medical assistant at Riverside Family Practice with my own apartment, my own car, and my own sense of purpose. I loved my job, loved helping patients feel better, loved the satisfaction of organizing medical records and making sure everything ran smoothly. I was good at what I did, respected by my colleagues, trusted by the doctors I worked with. Then I met Michael Thompson when he came in for a routine insurance physical. He was charming in the way that successful men often are, confident without being arrogant, interested without being overwhelming. He asked me out after his appointment, and I said yes, because it had been a long time since someone had looked at me like I was worth pursuing. Our courtship was a whirlwind of nice restaurants and weekend trips, thoughtful gifts and promises of a future that looked nothing like the paycheck-to-paycheck existence I'd known my whole life. When Michael proposed after 8 months of dating, it felt like winning the lottery. Here was a man with a stable job, a beautiful home in Mission Viejo, and plans for the kind of family life I'd always dreamed of, but never thought I could have. He wanted children, wanted a wife who could focus on being a mother instead of worrying about working 2 jobs to make ends meet. It sounded like paradise to someone who'd grown up watching her own mother work herself into exhaustion just to keep food on the table. The pregnancy with Jake was everything I'd hoped it would be. Michael was attentive and excited, converting his home office into a nursery and reading parenting books with the same intensity he applied to insurance actuarial tables. When Jake was born with his tiny fingers and serious dark eyes, I felt like my life had finally clicked into place. This was who I was meant to be, who I was meant to love and protect and nurture. But somewhere between Jake's first birthday and Emma's arrival 2 years later, things started to shift in ways that were too subtle to name at first. Michael began questioning my decisions more frequently, correcting my parenting choices in front of other people, suggesting that maybe I wasn't quite as naturally maternal as he'd initially thought. When Jake developed asthma as a toddler, Michael acted like it was somehow my fault, as if I'd failed to protect our son from something I should have been able to prevent. The real problem started when Emma was born with a dairy allergy that required careful attention to everything she ate. Michael seemed to view her dietary restrictions as a personal inconvenience rather than a medical necessity, and he began making comments about how complicated I was making everything, how other mothers seemed to manage just fine without all the drama and special accommodations. By the time our marriage fell apart completely, I'd internalized so much of his criticism that I sometimes wondered if he was right about me. Maybe I was too anxious, too protective, too focused on problems that weren't as serious as I made them out to be. Maybe other mothers really were better at balancing their children's needs without making such a big deal about every little thing. The divorce itself was swift and brutal. Michael had been planning it longer than I realized, consulting lawyers and financial advisors while I was still trying to figure out how to save our marriage. By the time he asked me to move out, he'd already established narrative that I was unstable, overwhelmed, and probably not capable of caring for the children on my own. The apartment I found in Moreno Valley was the best I could afford on my reduced income from part-time work at Valley Medical Center. It was clean and safe, but it was also small and old, and nothing like the spacious home Jake and Emma were used to. The first night they stayed with me, Emma cried because her room didn't have the princess wallpaper from Daddy's house, and Jake asked why the walls were so thin that we could hear the neighbors talking. I'd tried to make it feel like home, decorating their shared bedroom with bright colors and filling it with books and toys and art supplies. But I knew how it looked to outside observers, how it would look to a judge who was used to evaluating families based on square footage and neighborhood safety ratings rather than the amount of love that filled a space. The medical issues that Rebecca Collins was now presenting as evidence of my negligence, were the result of navigating a healthcare system that wasn't designed for single mothers working hourly jobs. When Jake's inhaler ran out on a Tuesday and the pharmacy couldn't fill it until Thursday because of insurance authorization delays, that wasn't neglect. That was a system that made it nearly impossible for people like me to access the care our children needed without jumping through hoops I didn't always have time to navigate. When Emma had allergic reactions to food she ate at school or at friends' houses, that wasn't because I wasn't managing her condition properly. That was because food allergies are complicated and unpredictable, and even the most careful parent can't control every variable in a child's environment. But in family court, context doesn't matter as much as documentation. And Michael had been very good at documenting every imperfect moment while conveniently forgetting to mention all the times I'd handled medical emergencies calmly and competently. He'd photographed Emma's hives but hadn't mentioned that I'd administered her antihistamine immediately and called her pediatrician for follow-up instructions. He'd noted the dates Jake's inhaler was empty but hadn't mentioned that I'd driven to 3 different pharmacies trying to find one that could fill the prescription early. Rebecca Collins was wrapping up her opening statement with the kind of flourish that probably impressed judges who didn't know better. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson isn't asking for sole custody because he wants to punish his ex-wife. He's asking for it because his children's health and safety depend on having a parent who takes medical responsibilities seriously. The evidence will show that Sarah Thompson, despite her good intentions, simply isn't equipped to handle the complex medical needs of children with chronic health conditions. I felt Lisa Chen shift beside me, preparing to make her own statement in my defense, but I already knew it would sound weak compared to Rebecca's confident presentation. We didn't have glossy photos of my apartment or documentation of every medical appointment I'd kept. We didn't have expert witnesses or character references from people whose opinions carried weight in rooms like this. What we had was the truth. But the truth is often messier and less impressive than carefully constructed narratives designed to win legal battles. The truth was that I loved my children more than my own life and had never done anything that wasn't in their best interest, even when those interests conflicted with my own comfort or convenience. The truth was that Jake and Emma were healthy, happy children who had never suffered any serious medical consequences from my care. Their asthma and allergies were well controlled. Their growth and development were normal, and their pediatrician had never expressed any concerns about their medical management. But as I sat in that courtroom listening to my parenting being dissected by strangers, I realized that the truth wasn't going to be enough unless I could find a way to make it as compelling as Michael's carefully constructed fiction. And sitting there in my borrowed blazer and discount shoes, I had no idea how I was going to do that. That's when I felt a small hand slip into mine and squeeze gently. Jake had turned around in his seat and was looking at me with an expression that was far too serious for an 8-year-old boy. "Mom," he whispered, "I have something important to show the judge." I squeezed his hand back, not understanding what he meant, but grateful for the reminder that no matter what happened in this courtroom, I wasn't alone. Whatever Jake wanted to show the judge, whatever happened next, we were in this together. And sometimes that's all the strength you need to keep fighting for what matters most. The weight of what could happen pressed down on me like a physical force. Losing Jake and Emma wasn't just about losing custody or visitation rights. It was about losing the center of my entire world, the reason I got up every morning and pushed through days that sometimes felt impossible to survive. These weren't just my children. They were my purpose, my heart walking around outside my body, the only thing that mattered in a life that had been stripped down to its most essential elements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought about Jake's quiet way of checking on me when he thought I was sad, how he'd bring me his favorite stuffed elephant without saying anything, just placing it next to me on the couch like a gentle offering of comfort. I thought about Emma's infectious giggle when we made pancakes on Sunday mornings, how she'd insist on pouring the batter herself even though half of it ended up on the counter instead of in the pan. These were the moments that sustained me through the hardest days, the memories that reminded me why every sacrifice was worth it. If Michael won custody, I wouldn't just lose my children. I'd lose my identity as their mother, the role that had given my life meaning even when everything else fell apart. I'd become a visitor in their lives, someone they saw on weekends and holidays if I was lucky, someone who had to ask permission to take them to doctor's appointments or help with homework. The thought made my chest tight with panic that threatened to overwhelm my ability to sit still and appear composed. I could already picture them in Michael's sterile, perfect house, eating meals prepared by whatever nanny he'd hired to replace me, sleeping in rooms that looked like something from a home decorating magazine, but felt nothing like the cozy sanctuary I'd created for them in our small apartment. Would they remember how I used to sing to them when they were scared at night? Would they remember the silly voices I did when reading their bedtime stories? Or would those memories fade, replaced by the efficient care of paid professionals who did their jobs well but could never love them the way I did? The financial disparity between Michael and me wasn't just about money. It was about the entire system that seemed designed to equate resources with worthiness as a parent. He could afford private doctors who knew his name and took his calls immediately. I had to wait in line at community health clinics and hope that whoever saw us that day would have access to Jake and Emma's complete medical history. He could pay for organic food and name-brand medications without checking price tags. I clipped coupons and bought generic versions of everything, constantly calculating whether we could afford the upgrades that might make their lives a little easier or healthier. But none of that meant I loved them less or cared for them worse. If anything, it meant I had to be more creative, more resourceful, more attentive to their needs because I couldn't simply throw money at problems until they disappeared. When Jake had an asthma attack at 3 a.m, I was the one who stayed calm and administered his rescue inhaler while timing his breathing and deciding whether we needed to go to the emergency room. When Emma accidentally ate something, with dairy at a birthday party, I was the one who recognized the early signs of a reaction and got her antihistamine into her system before it became serious. I knew their bodies, their rhythms, their personalities in ways that Michael never had and never would. I knew that Jake's asthma was triggered more by stress and excitement than by environmental factors, which was why his symptoms often got worse during the transitions between our homes. I knew that Emma's food allergies were manageable as long as I read every label and communicated with every caregiver, but that she was also a normal 5-year-old who sometimes forgot to mention that she'd shared someone's snack until after the fact. These weren't signs of neglect or incompetence on my part. They were the realities of parenting children with medical conditions that required constant vigilance and frequent adjustments. But in a courtroom where everything was reduced to documentation and expert testimony, my intimate knowledge of my children's needs looked less impressive than Michael's ability to pay for premium healthcare and private physicians. The cruelest part of Rebecca Collins's accusations was how they twisted my greatest strengths as a mother into evidence of my supposed failures. My careful attention to Jake's breathing patterns became anxiety and overprotection. My methodical approach to managing Emma's allergies became obsessive and restrictive. My willingness to seek multiple medical opinions when I was concerned about their symptoms became shopping around for doctors who would tell me what I wanted to hear. I wanted to stand up and tell Judge Martinez about the night Jake had pneumonia, and I stayed awake for 72 hours straight, monitoring his fever and making sure he was getting enough fluids. I wanted to describe how I'd taught Emma to recognize the early signs of an allergic reaction so she could advocate for herself even when I wasn't there. I wanted to explain that every medical decision I'd made for my children was based on careful research, consultation with healthcare providers, and an understanding of their individual needs that went far deeper than any checklist or protocol. But family court wasn't interested in stories about midnight vigils or mother's intuition. It wanted documentation, expert witnesses, and evidence that could be quantified and compared. Michael had those things because he had money and time and a team of professionals working to present his case in the most favorable light possible. I had love and experience and an unshakable commitment to my children's well-being, but none of those things translated well into legal briefs or courtroom presentations. Sitting there listening to my parenting being systematically demolished by someone who'd never met my children, I felt a familiar sense of powerlessness that had become too common since my divorce. It was the same feeling I'd had when Michael emptied our joint savings account without warning, or when he'd refused to help with medical expenses that weren't technically required by our divorce decree, or when he'd scheduled his visitation times to conflict with important school events, just because he could. The system was designed to favor people like Michael, people with resources, connections, and the ability to hire professionals who knew how to work within legal frameworks to achieve desired outcomes. People like me were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of justice we could get, to accept that being poor meant having fewer rights and less protection under the law. But these were my children we were talking about, and being poor didn't make me love them less or care for them. Worse, if anything, it had made me more resourceful, more attentive, more determined to give them everything they needed, even when that meant sacrificing things I wanted or needed for myself. I'd learned to stretch every dollar, to find free activities that would enrich their lives, to create joy and stability in circumstances that were far from ideal. The apartment we lived in might not have been impressive by Mission Viejo standards, but it was filled with laughter and creativity and the kind of unconditional love that money couldn't buy. Jake had his own corner where he could build elaborate Lego structures that stayed up for weeks at a time. Emma had claimed a section of the living room wall where she could display her artwork and change it whenever the mood struck her. We'd turned the small balcony into a container garden where they could help grow vegetables and flowers, teaching them responsibility while also supplementing our grocery budget with fresh produce. These were the details that mattered to me, the evidence of our life together that couldn't be captured in financial statements or medical records. But they were also the details that would never make it into a courtroom, the kinds of intangible assets that didn't translate into legal arguments about fitness as a parent. I thought about all the nights I'd fallen asleep in Jake's bed after helping him through an asthma flare-up, all the times I'd gotten up early to pack Emma's special allergy-free lunch and include a note reminding her how much I loved her. I thought about the careful way I'd learned to navigate insurance systems and pharmacy policies to make sure their medications were always available, the research I'd done on natural remedies and environmental modifications that might help reduce their symptoms. Every decision I'd made as their mother had been guided by love and the desire to give them the best possible life within our circumstances. But as I sat in that courtroom watching Rebecca Collins paint a picture of me as careless and negligent, I realized that love might not be enough to protect them from a system that valued appearances over substance. That's when I felt Jake's hand squeeze mine again, and I looked down to see him watching me with those serious dark eyes that seemed older than his 8 years. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, a mixture of determination and protectiveness that reminded me so much of myself at his age, when I'd had to learn too early how to be strong in situations that were bigger than I was. Whatever he had to show the judge, whatever was coming next, I realized that my children were watching how I handled this crisis, learning lessons about resilience and dignity that would stay with them long after this courtroom drama was resolved. No matter what happened, I needed to show them that fighting for what you love is always worth it, even when the odds seem impossible to overcome. Michael Thompson and I met during what I now realize was the last truly carefree period of my adult life. I was 28, working as a medical assistant at Riverside Family Practice, and finally starting to feel like I'd figured out who I was supposed to be. The job was perfect for someone with my personality: organized, detail-oriented, naturally nurturing, and genuinely interested in helping people feel better. I loved the variety of tasks, from updating patient files to assisting with minor procedures, from answering questions about medications to providing the kind of gentle reassurance that anxious patients needed. Dr. Patricia Williams, the family, physician I worked with most closely, often told me I had a gift for making people feel heard and cared for during some of their most vulnerable moments. She'd encouraged me to consider going back to school for nursing or even medical school, but I was content with my role. I felt useful and appreciated without the crushing debt and overwhelming responsibility that came with higher medical degrees. My life outside of work was simple but satisfying. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment in Corona with my roommate Jessica, a teacher who became one of my closest friends. We spent our weekends hiking in the nearby mountains, trying new restaurants in Riverside's growing downtown district, or hosting small dinner parties for our circle of friends. I was dating occasionally, but not seriously, more focused on building a stable foundation for whatever came next than on finding someone to complete me. I felt independent and capable in ways I'd never experienced before. Having grown up in a household where money was always tight and my mother worked multiple jobs just to keep us afloat, there was something deeply satisfying about being able to pay my bills on time, save a little money each month, and make choices based on what I wanted rather than what we could afford. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My car was paid off, my credit was good, and I had a small but growing savings account that represented the first real financial security I'd ever known. I decorated my half of the apartment with furniture from thrift stores and discount retailers, but every piece was chosen carefully and reflected my personal taste. I was proud of the life I'd built for myself, modest though it might have seemed to others. When Michael came in for his insurance physical that Tuesday morning in October, I noticed him immediately. Not just because he was handsome, though he was in that clean-cut professional way that suggested success and stability, but because he was polite to everyone in the office, from the elderly receptionist to the nervous teenage patient who was waiting for his first physical. He seemed genuinely interested in people rather than just going through the motions of social interaction. During his appointment, he asked thoughtful questions about the tests Dr. Williams was ordering and listened carefully to her explanations. When I took his blood pressure, he complimented the efficiency of our office and mentioned how impressed he was with the way we'd handled his appointment scheduling. It was clear he was the kind of person who noticed details and appreciated good service, qualities that appealed to someone like me who took pride in doing things well. What really caught my attention, though, was the way he interacted with Mrs. Chen, an elderly patient who was struggling to understand her new medication regimen. While most people his age would have been checking their phones or showing signs of impatience, Michael actually listened to her concerns and asked if she needed help understanding the pharmacy instructions. It was a small gesture, but it suggested a level of empathy and consideration that seemed rare in successful businessmen. When he asked me out after his appointment, I almost said no out of professional habit. Dating patients was generally discouraged, even former patients whose medical needs had been completed. But there was something about his approach that felt respectful rather than opportunistic. He acknowledged that he understood if office policies made dating complicated, and he suggested coffee rather than dinner, something casual that wouldn't put pressure on either of us. Our first date was everything I could have hoped for. He picked a small coffee shop in Riverside's downtown area that I'd mentioned loving, and he arrived exactly on time with flowers that were thoughtful without being overwhelming. He asked questions about my work, my family, my interests, and he listened to my answers with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. Michael talked about his job as an insurance executive in ways that made it sound both challenging and meaningful. He worked for a company that specialized in health insurance policies, and he seemed genuinely committed to finding ways to make healthcare more accessible and affordable for working families. He spoke passionately about policy changes that could help people like the patients I saw every day, people who sometimes had to choose between medication and groceries because their insurance coverage was inadequate. He was well-traveled but not pretentious about it, educated but not condescending, successful but not materialistic in the flashy way that sometimes made me uncomfortable around wealthy people. When he talked about his house in Mission Viejo, he focused on the neighborhood's good schools and family-friendly atmosphere rather than the square footage or property value. He seemed like someone who had his priorities in the right place. What impressed me most was his interest in building a family. Unlike many men his age who seemed to view children as distant future possibilities, Michael talked about wanting kids with the kind of specificity that suggested he'd given it serious thought. He wanted to be the kind of father who was present and engaged, who coached little league teams and helped with homework, and created the kind of stable, loving home environment that would give his children every advantage in life. As someone who'd grown up with a single mother who worked constantly just to survive, the appeal of building a family with someone who could provide both emotional stability and financial security was overwhelming. I'd always wanted children, but I'd also always worried about being able to give them everything they deserved on a medical assistant's salary. Michael offered the possibility of a different kind of future, one where my children could have opportunities I'd never dreamed of. Our courtship moved quickly, but never felt rushed. Michael was thoughtful about introducing me to different aspects of his life gradually, from casual dinners at his house to meeting his colleagues at work events, to spending weekends exploring Southern California attractions I'd never had time or money to visit. He made me feel special without making me feel like a charity case, treating me as an equal partner, even though our financial situations were dramatically different. When he proposed 8 months after our first date, it was during a weekend trip to Santa Barbara that felt like something from a romantic movie. He'd planned everything perfectly, from the oceanfront hotel to the sunset dinner to the timing of the proposal itself. The ring was beautiful, but not ostentatious, sized correctly because he'd somehow figured out my ring size without me noticing. Everything about the moment felt like he'd listened carefully to who I was and what would make me happy. The engagement period was a whirlwind of planning and preparation that felt like stepping into someone else's life. Michael insisted on paying for everything, from the wedding venue to my dress, to the honeymoon in Hawaii that seemed impossibly luxurious to someone who'd never stayed in a hotel that cost more than $70 a night. He wanted our wedding to be perfect, and he had both the resources and the attention to detail to make that happen. I should have noticed then how easily he took control of decisions that should have been ours to make together. When I suggested a smaller, less expensive ceremony, he laughed and said he wanted to show me off to everyone who mattered in his life. When I offered to contribute financially, he insisted that his bride shouldn't have to worry about money. When I tried to include more of my friends and family in the planning process, he gently redirected the conversation toward choices that would be more impressive to his colleagues and business associates. At the time, his take-charge attitude felt romantic and protective. Here was a man who wanted to take care of me, who saw value in what I brought to the relationship beyond my ability to contribute financially. He praised my nurturing instincts, my organizational skills, my natural ability to make people feel comfortable and cared for. He talked about how lucky any children of ours would be to have me as their mother, how perfect I'd be at creating the kind of warm, loving home environment that would balance his more driven, ambitious personality. I felt chosen and cherished in ways I'd never experienced before. Michael made me feel like I was exactly what he'd been looking for, like our different backgrounds and experiences complemented each other perfectly. He was practical where I was, emotional, ambitious where I was content, strategic where I was intuitive. Together, we seemed to create something balanced and complete. The red flags were there, but they were subtle and easily explained away by someone who wanted desperately to believe in the fairy tale romance Michael was creating for us. His corrections of my social mistakes felt like helpful guidance from someone who understood professional etiquette better than I did. His suggestions about my wardrobe seemed like generous offers to help me fit into his social circle. His tendency to make decisions without consulting me looked like efficiency rather than control. By the time we were married and I'd moved into his beautiful house in Mission Viejo, I'd already begun the gradual process of disappearing into the life he'd designed for us. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just a slow erosion of my independence that felt like natural adaptation to married life. I was learning to be the wife Michael needed, the partner who would support his career and create the kind of home that reflected well on his success and social standing. Looking back now, I can see how methodically he dismantled my sense of self, but at the time it felt like love. When he suggested I quit my job to focus on getting pregnant and preparing for motherhood, it seemed like the generous offer of a man who wanted to give me everything I'd ever dreamed of. When he took over managing our finances because he was better with money and investment strategies, it felt like practical division of labor rather than a loss of autonomy. I was so grateful for the security and stability he offered that I didn't recognize how completely I was surrendering my ability to take care of myself. By the time Jake was born, I was entirely dependent on Michael for everything from health insurance to spending money, and I'd convinced myself that this was what successful marriages looked like. The transformation was so gradual that I didn't realize how much I'd lost until it was too late to get it back without a fight that would destroy everything I thought we'd built together. And by then, I had children to consider. Little lives that depended on the stability Michael provided. And I couldn't imagine any scenario where fighting for my independence wouldn't hurt them more than it would help me. The reality of our financial situation hit me fully about 6 months after Michael moved out, when I realized that the joint checking account I'd relied on for everything from groceries to Jake's asthma medication had been quietly drained over a period of weeks. I'd been so focused on managing the children's emotional adjustment to their parents' separation that I hadn't been monitoring our finances as closely as I should have been. When my debit card was declined at the pharmacy while trying to fill Emma's allergy medication, I knew something was terribly wrong. The conversation with the bank teller was humiliating in ways I'm still processing. Sitting in that sterile office with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick, I learned that Michael had been systematically transferring money out of our joint account and into accounts that only he could access. The transfers had been small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but consistent enough that by the time I realized what was happening, there was less than $300 left of what had once been our family's entire savings. The teller, a young woman who couldn't have been much older than 25, explained the situation with the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested she'd had this conversation with newly divorced women many times before. She handed me printouts, showing months of transfers, each one stamped with dates that corresponded with arguments Michael and I had been having about our future. While I'd been trying to save our marriage, he'd been systematically ensuring that I'd have no financial resources to survive without him. The worst part wasn't the money itself, though losing our savings was devastating enough. The worst part was realizing how long he'd been planning to leave, how many conversations we'd had about working things out while he was already 3 steps ahead, building a new life that didn't include me. Every time I'd suggested counseling or talked about making changes to fix our relationship, he'd been moving money around and consulting lawyers and making arrangements that would leave me completely powerless. I drove home from the bank that day with a check for the remaining balance in our account, a sum that wouldn't even cover our rent for the following month. The children were at school, and I sat in our empty house in Mission Viejo, surrounded by furniture and possessions that would all belong to Michael once our divorce was finalized, and tried to figure out how I was going to survive the next week, let alone the next year. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt like a museum, filled with beautiful things I'd never really owned, and memories of a life I'd never really controlled. I walked through rooms that had been decorated according to Michael's preferences, looking at photographs of family vacations I'd been grateful for but had never planned, touching furniture that had been chosen for its appearance rather than its comfort. Everything around me represented a life I'd been allowed to participate in, but had never truly belonged to. Finding an apartment I could afford on my part-time income from Valley Medical Center was like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. Landlords wanted proof of income that was 3 times the monthly rent, security deposits that required savings I no longer had, and references from previous landlords, even though I'd been living in Michael's house for the past 4 years. The Apartments I could theoretically afford were either in neighborhoods with schools I didn't trust or in buildings with maintenance issues that made them unsuitable for children with respiratory conditions. The place I finally found in Moreno Valley was a compromise born of desperation rather than choice. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that had been built in the 1980s and showed every year of its age, but it was clean, and the landlord was willing to work with my employment situation if I could come up with an extra month's rent as additional security. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it also wasn't the kind of place where children rode bikes in the street or neighbors knew each other's names. Moving day was one of the hardest experiences of my adult life, not because of the physical work, but because of watching Jake and Emma try to process the dramatic change in their living situation. They'd gone from a 4-bedroom house with a pool and a 3-car garage to a small apartment where they'd have to share a bedroom and learn to live without the space and privacy they'd always taken for granted. Emma kept asking when we were going to go back to our real house, while Jake quietly helped me unpack boxes with the kind of serious concentration that suggested he understood more about our situation than I'd given him credit for. The apartment complex was home to a mix of families who were all struggling in different ways. There were single mothers like me, elderly people on fixed incomes, young couples just starting out, and immigrant families working multiple jobs to build better lives for their children. It wasn't the kind of community I'd ever imagined being part of, but it was also more supportive and understanding than the suburban neighborhood we'd left behind, where financial struggles were hidden behind perfect lawns and expensive cars. My neighbors didn't judge me for hanging laundry on the balcony to save money on electricity, or for shopping with carefully organized coupons, or for buying generic brands of everything from cereal to children's medications. They understood what it meant to stretch every dollar and make difficult choices about priorities and necessities. When Jake had an asthma attack at 3 a.m, and I needed someone to watch Emma while I took him to the emergency room, Mrs. Garcia from next door appeared at my door in her bathrobe without my even having to ask. The job at Valley Medical Center was a step down from my previous position in almost every way that mattered professionally. Instead of working directly with patients and doctors as a medical assistant, I was filing paperwork and updating computer records in a windowless office that smelled like disinfectant and copy machine toner. The pay was significantly less than what I'd been making before my marriage, and the hours were limited enough that I qualified for state assistance programs that I'd never imagined needing. But the job also provided health insurance for the children and me, which was essential given Jake's asthma and Emma's allergies. It gave me a paycheck that, while small, was predictable and entirely under my control. Most importantly, it was a stepping stone back toward the kind of work I'd loved before I'd gotten married, a way to rebuild the professional skills and confidence I'd lost during my years as a full-time mother and wife. The daily routine we established in our new life was built around careful budgeting and creative problem-solving. I learned to shop for groceries with a calculator, planning meals around what was on sale and what I could prepare in bulk to stretch our food budget as far as possible. I discovered which stores marked down produce at the end of the day, which pharmacies offered discount programs for prescription medications, and which community resources were available for families in situations like ours. Jake and Emma adapted to our new circumstances with a resilience that both amazed and broke my heart. They learned to entertain themselves in smaller spaces, to appreciate simple pleasures like library story time and free concerts in the park, and to understand that maybe next time often meant probably never when they asked for toys or treats that were beyond our budget. They never complained, but I could see them processing the changes in ways that no children should have to. Emma developed a habit of hoarding small treasures, interesting rocks, pretty leaves, stickers from the doctor's office, in a shoebox under her bed, as if she was building a collection of beautiful things that couldn't be taken away from her. Jake became intensely protective of his few possessions, organizing and reorganizing his books and toys with a meticulousness that reminded me painfully of my own anxious need to control whatever small aspects of our lives I still could. The hardest part of our new reality was navigating the children's visitation schedule with Michael. Every other weekend, I had to watch them pack overnight bags and drive away in his luxury SUV to spend 48 hours in a world that had everything our apartment lacked. They came back with stories about restaurants I couldn't afford to take them to, activities I couldn't provide, and casual mentions of things their father had bought them that I knew they needed, but couldn't give them. Michael was strategic about these contrasts in ways that felt deliberately cruel. He'd return them wearing new clothes that were clearly expensive, but completely impractical for our lifestyle. He'd fill their heads with plans for summer camps and private lessons that he knew I couldn't afford to continue. He'd ask them questions about our apartment, our food, our daily routine in ways that felt like gathering intelligence rather than showing genuine interest in their lives. The children never directly compared their father's house to our apartment, but I could see them making mental calculations about the differences, trying to understand why their lives had become so dramatically smaller and more limited. Jake started having more frequent asthma attacks during the transitions between homes, and Emma began having difficulty sleeping for several days after each visitation. Their pediatrician suggested that the stress of moving between such different environments might be contributing to their symptoms, but there was nothing I could do to change the situation. Doctor visits became exercises in careful financial planning and strategic timing. I had to choose between taking time off work, which meant losing pay I couldn't afford to lose, and scheduling appointments for times when the children would miss school, which looked bad on their attendance records. I learned to batch their medical needs whenever possible, trying to address multiple concerns during single visits to minimize co-pays and transportation costs. The community health clinic, where we received most of their care, was staffed by dedicated professionals who did their best with limited resources, but it was also overcrowded and understaffed in ways that made comprehensive care challenging. We often waited for hours to see a doctor for 15 minutes, and there was little continuity between visits since we rarely saw the same physician twice. I started keeping detailed notes about their symptoms and medication responses, creating my own medical records to supplement the fragmented official documentation. Managing Jake's asthma became a constant balancing act between vigilance and affordability. His rescue inhaler cost over $60, even with our insurance, and the controller medication that helped prevent attacks was nearly twice that amount. I learned to stretch his medications by carefully monitoring his triggers and symptoms, sometimes rationing doses when I wasn't sure when I'd be able to afford refills. The guilt of making medical decisions based on financial considerations rather than optimal care was something I carried with me constantly. Emma's food allergies required a different kind of vigilance, one that involved reading every ingredient label and educating every caretaker about her restrictions. The specialty foods she needed were expensive and often only available at stores that were far from our apartment, adding transportation costs to grocery bills that were already stretched thin. I learned to prepare most of her meals from scratch, both to save money and to ensure that everything she ate was safe. The social worker assigned to monitor our family situation during the custody proceedings was a well-meaning woman named Karen, who visited our apartment once a month to assess our living conditions and the children's well-being. These visits filled me with anxiety for days beforehand, as I deep-cleaned every surface and tried to present our life in the most positive light possible. I knew she was looking for signs of neglect or instability, and I was terrified that our modest circumstances would be interpreted as inadequate care. Karen's reports were carefully neutral, documenting the size of our living space, the contents of our refrigerator, the children's cleanliness and apparent happiness. She noted that Jake and Emma seemed well-adjusted, and that I appeared to be meeting their basic needs. But she also observed that their father's home offered more space, resources, and educational opportunities. Her assessments felt like gentle criticisms wrapped in professional language, suggestions that love and attention might not be enough to provide optimal outcomes for children with special medical needs. The legal proceedings themselves were bewildering and expensive in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even with a court-appointed advocate, there were filing fees, document preparation costs, and transportation expenses that added up to significant amounts for someone living on my budget. I had to take unpaid time off work for court dates, mediation sessions, and meetings with social workers, losing income while simultaneously incurring costs I couldn't afford. Michael's lawyer seemed to have unlimited resources to gather evidence, hire experts, and present their case in the most favorable light possible. They had photographs of his house, documentation of his income, and character references from colleagues and neighbors who could speak to his stability and success. They had medical records that showed his ability to provide premium health care and educational plans that demonstrated his commitment to the children's future development. My advocate did her best with the resources available to her, but we were clearly outmatched in terms of presentation and documentation. We had proof that I'd never missed a medical appointment or failed to provide necessary care, but we also had evidence of the financial constraints that made that care more challenging to coordinate. We had testimony about my devotion to the children, but we also had records of the modest circumstances that suggested limitations in my ability to provide opportunities and advantages. The disparity between our legal representations felt like a preview of the court's eventual decision. In a system where resources translated directly into persuasive power, I was fighting with determination and love against money and professional expertise. The outcome seemed predetermined by factors that had nothing to do with the quality of my parenting or the strength of my bond with Jake and Emma. But I kept fighting because giving up wasn't an option. These were my children, the center of my world. The reason I got up every morning and pushed through days that sometimes felt impossible. Whatever it took, however long the process lasted, however much it cost me personally, I was going to prove that being poor didn't make me a bad mother, and that love was more important than luxury when it came to raising happy, healthy children. The night before our final court date, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to Jake's steady breathing from the bedroom he shared with Emma. I thought about all the ways I'd failed to protect them from the consequences of my marriage's collapse. All the compromises I'd had to make that had affected their daily lives in ways both large and small. But I also thought about all the ways we'd grown stronger together, all the problems we'd solved, and challenges we'd overcome through teamwork and creativity and unconditional love. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I knew that I'd given everything. I had to being the best mother possible under circumstances that were far from ideal. I'd advocated for their health, prioritized their happiness, and sacrificed my own comfort and convenience to ensure that they felt secure and loved despite the upheaval in their lives. If that wasn't enough to convince a judge that they belonged with me, then the system was more broken than I'd ever imagined. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, I had no idea that Jake had been carrying a secret that would change everything. That my 8-year-old son had been quietly collecting evidence of his own that would prove more powerful than any argument Michael's expensive lawyers could make. Sometimes the truth finds its own way to the surface, and sometimes it comes through the voice of a child who understands justice in ways that adults have forgotten. The courtroom felt different the morning of our hearing, charged with an energy that made my skin feel tight and my breathing shallow. I'd been in this same room multiple times over the past months, but today, everything seemed sharper, more final, as if the very air knew that decisions were about to be made that couldn't be undone. Judge Martinez entered with the same brisk efficiency she'd shown during previous proceedings, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was as ready as everyone else to reach a resolution. Rebecca Collins rose to present what she'd told us would be her closing arguments, the final summary of evidence that would supposedly prove Michael's superior fitness as a parent. She'd arranged her materials with the kind of meticulous organization that spoke of countless hours of preparation and significant financial resources dedicated to winning this case. Her confidence was evident in every gesture, every pause, every carefully modulated phrase designed to leave no doubt about the correct outcome. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted her own arguments. "The evidence in this case presents a clear choice between stability and chaos, between resources and limitations, between a parent who can provide optimal care and one who struggles to meet basic needs. My client, Michael Thompson, represents everything we hope for in a custodial parent: financial security, emotional stability, and the ability to provide his children with every advantage as they grow and develop. She gestured toward a stack of documents that seemed to grow taller every time I looked at it, evidence of Michael's superior circumstances that had been gathered and organized with the kind of thoroughness that money could buy. Mr. Thompson's home provides Jake and Emma with their own bedrooms, a safe neighborhood with excellent schools, and access to premium health care that ensures their medical needs are met by the best specialists available. He can provide private tutoring, extracurricular activities, and educational opportunities that will give them competitive advantages throughout their academic careers. I felt my chest tighten as she continued, knowing that every word she spoke was technically true, even though it completely missed the point of what made someone a good parent. Michael could indeed provide things I couldn't afford, opportunities I couldn't create, advantages I couldn't give Jake and Emma despite loving them more than my own life. In a world where parenting was evaluated like a business plan, his proposal was clearly superior to mine. In contrast, Rebecca continued, and I braced myself for the systematic demolition of my life that I knew was coming. Ms. Thompson's current circumstances present ongoing challenges that directly impact the children's well-being. Her apartment is small and located in a neighborhood with higher crime rates and lower-performing schools. Her income is insufficient to provide consistent health care, nutritious food, or educational enrichment. Most critically, her inability to properly manage Jake's asthma and Emma's allergies has resulted in preventable medical incidents that could have serious long-term consequences. The phrase, preventable medical incidents, hit me like a physical blow, reducing complex situations involving insurance delays, pharmacy policies, and the realities of managing chronic conditions on a limited budget to simple negligence on my part. She made it sound like I'd deliberately put my children at risk, rather than navigating systems that were designed to be difficult for people in my financial situation. Jake's inhaler has been empty on multiple occasions, she continued, pulling out photographs that Michael had apparently taken of the expired rescue medication as evidence of my failures. Emma has suffered allergic reactions that required emergency treatment because her mother failed to properly communicate her dietary restrictions to caregivers. These aren't isolated incidents, Your Honor. They represent a pattern of inadequate medical management that puts both children's health and safety at ongoing risk. I wanted to explain about the insurance authorization that had delayed Jake's prescription refill, about the school snack incident that had happened despite my careful communication with Emma's teacher, about the countless times I'd successfully prevented and managed medical emergencies that Michael had never even known about. But I also knew that explanations would sound like excuses, and excuses would make me look defensive rather than responsible. Rebecca's presentation continued with the relentless efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, each point building on the previous one to create an overwhelming case for removing my children from my care. She had documentation of every imperfect moment, every financial struggle, every compromise I'd been forced to make in trying to provide for Jake and Emma on resources that were inadequate to their needs. What she didn't have, and what couldn't be captured in photographs or financial statements, was any understanding of the daily reality of our lives together. She couldn't document the nights I'd stayed awake monitoring Jake's breathing during asthma flare-ups, or the creative ways I'd found to make Emma's restricted diet feel special rather than limiting. She couldn't measure the strength of our bond, or the security the children felt in knowing that I would always put their needs before my own comfort or convenience. As she spoke, I found myself studying Jake's face, trying to read his expression as he listened to this stranger describe his life in terms that made everything we'd built together sound inadequate and harmful. He was sitting very still, his hands folded in his lap, but his eyes were moving between Rebecca and Judge Martinez with an intensity that seemed unusual, even for a child who'd always been more observant than most kids his age. Emma was drawing on a piece of paper with crayons that Lisa Chen had provided to keep her occupied during the proceedings. but I could tell she was listening too. Her artwork had started out cheerful and colorful, but as Rebecca's presentation continued, her drawings had become darker and more chaotic, reflecting the tension she was absorbing from the adults around her. The worst part of listening to Rebecca's arguments wasn't the way she characterized my circumstances, though that was painful enough. The worst part was watching how effectively she was building a case that would separate me from my children, based on factors that had nothing to do with the quality of our relationship or my capabilities as a mother. In her presentation, poverty was equivalent to neglect, financial limitation was the same as parental failure, and love was irrelevant if it couldn't be backed up with premium resources. Judge Martinez was taking notes throughout Rebecca's presentation, her expression carefully neutral but attentive in ways that suggested she was finding the arguments persuasive. She asked occasional questions about specific incidents or documentation, but her tone was professional rather than skeptical. It was clear that Rebecca's case was landing with the impact she'd intended, creating doubt about my fitness as a parent that would be difficult for my advocate to overcome. When Rebecca finally concluded her presentation and returned to her seat next to Michael, the silence in the courtroom felt heavy with unspoken decisions. I could see satisfaction in her posture, confidence in Michael's expression, and resignation in Lisa Chen's careful shuffling of our much smaller stack of evidence. The battle felt over before my side had even had a chance to present our defense. That's when Jake stood up. Not dramatically or disruptively, but with the quiet determination of a child who'd made up his mind about something important and wasn't going to be talked out of it. He looked directly at Judge Martinez and said, in a voice that was clear and steady despite his young age, "Excuse me, Your Honor, I have something important that everyone needs to see." Every eye in the courtroom turned toward my 8-year-old son as he stood there with a manila envelope clutched in his small hands, his expression more serious than any child should ever have to be. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim slightly, as if the entire building was holding its breath to see what Jake had brought to show Judge Martinez. Rebecca Collins straightened in her chair, her confidence faltering for the first time all morning, while Michael's face went completely pale. Jake walked forward with measured steps, his sneakers making soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He approached the judge's bench with the kind of careful respect that children reserve. For adults, they genuinely want to impress, not because they're afraid, but because they understand the importance of the moment they're living through. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "My mom didn't know I was bringing this today, but I've been listening to everything everyone's been saying about her, and it's not true. She takes really good care of me and Emma, better than anyone else could. I have proof." Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been concern. It wasn't often that children spoke up during custody proceedings, and when they did, it usually meant something significant was about to be revealed. She gestured for Jake to come closer to the bench. "What kind of proof do you have, young man?" she asked, her voice gentler than it had been during any of the adult testimony. Jake opened the manila envelope with careful precision, as if he'd practiced this moment multiple times in his head. From inside, he pulled out a stack of certificates and papers that he'd obviously organized with the same methodical attention to detail that I recognized from watching him arrange his Lego collections and school projects. Each document was protected in a clear plastic sleeve, and he'd arranged them in chronological order with the precision of someone who understood that presentation mattered. "These are my perfect attendance awards," Jake announced, holding up the first certificate so everyone in the courtroom could see it. "I got one for kindergarten, one for first grade, and one for this year in second grade. Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm the only kid in my class who's never missed a single day of school since I started." He handed the certificates to Judge Martinez, one by one, explaining each document with the kind of thorough detail that made it clear he'd thought carefully about what information would be most important. "This one's from kindergarten, when I first got my asthma diagnosis. Mom learned everything about my medicine and made sure I always had my inhaler with me. This one's from first grade, when Emma started having her allergy problems, and Mom had to figure out how to take care of both of us at the same time. As Jake continued his presentation, I felt tears starting to form in my eyes, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming pride and love that I'd never experienced before. My son had understood something that all the adults in this room had missed. He'd recognized that perfect attendance wasn't just about showing up to school, it was about having a mother who prioritized his health and well-being above everything else, who made sure he was stable enough to participate in normal childhood activities despite his medical conditions. The thing is, Jake continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his subject, you can't have perfect attendance if your mom doesn't take good care of you. Mrs. Rodriguez told us that kids with asthma miss a lot of school because they're IE. Parents don't know how to prevent attacks or don't have the right medications. But I never miss school because my mom knows exactly what I need and when I need it. Judge Martinez was examining each certificate carefully, reading the small print, and dates with the kind of attention that suggested she was beginning to understand the significance of what Jake was showing her. Perfect attendance awards weren't just pieces of paper handed out for showing up. They represented consistent health management, reliable transportation, adequate nutrition, and the kind of stable home environment that allowed a child to maintain regular routines despite underlying medical challenges. There's more, Jake said, pulling out another set of documents from his envelope. These are from the school nurse. She keeps track of every time I use my rescue inhaler at school, and she writes notes about how I'm feeling and whether my mom needs to be called. Look at these dates. He handed Judge Martinez a stack of school health records that I had no idea he'd been collecting. The forms showed a clear pattern of proactive asthma management, with detailed notes about environmental triggers, medication timing, and communication between school staff and home. What they revealed was a mother who wasn't neglecting her son's medical needs, but was working closely with healthcare professionals to ensure optimal management of his condition. See, when other kids have asthma attacks, their parents have to come pick them up and take them home, Jake explained with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they're sharing information they consider obviously important. But my mom taught me how to recognize when I need my rescue inhaler before it gets bad, and she taught the school nurse what to look for too. So I hardly ever have to go home sick. Rebecca Collins was shuffling through her papers frantically, clearly looking for some way to counter Jake's unexpected testimony. Michael was staring at his son with an expression that mixed surprise with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Neither of them had anticipated that an 8-year-old would be capable of presenting evidence that directly contradicted their carefully constructed narrative about my inadequacies as a parent. And here's the really important part, Jake continued, pulling out one final document that made my heart skip a beat when I recognized what it was. This is a letter from Dr. Foster, our family doctor. Mom asked me to give it to you because she wanted you to know the truth about how she takes care of us. The letter from Dr. Amanda Foster was something I'd requested during one of Emma's routine checkups, when I'd explained our custody situation and asked whether she'd be willing to provide documentation about the children's medical care. I'd given it to Jake to put in his backpack so he could deliver it to his teacher for his school health file, but apparently he'd held onto it for this moment instead. Judge Martinez read Dr. Foster's letter silently, her expression changing subtly as she absorbed the medical professional's assessment of my parenting capabilities. When she finished reading, she looked up at Jake with something that might have been admiration mixed with concern about the burden he'd been carrying. "Jake," she said gently, "this letter from your doctor says some very important things about your mother's care. Can you tell me why you thought it was important for me to see these documents today?" Jake looked directly at her with the kind of earnest intensity that only children can manage when they're speaking about something they care deeply about. Because everyone keeps saying my mom doesn't take good care of our health, but that's not true. She knows more about my asthma than anyone except maybe Dr. Foster. She can tell when I'm going to have problems before I even feel bad. and she never, ever forgets my medicine or lets me do things that might make me sick." He paused for a moment, glancing back at me with an expression that was both protective and apologetic, as if he was sorry for having to defend me but determined to do whatever it took to set the record straight. The times when my inhaler was empty, that wasn't because Mom forgot. It was because the pharmacy said our insurance wouldn't pay for a new one yet, even though the old one was almost gone. Mom called like 5 different people trying to get it fixed, and she made me stay home from soccer practice until she could get me a new inhaler. The detail in Jake's testimony was staggering, revealing a level of awareness about his own medical care that spoke to countless conversations we'd had about his condition, his treatment, and the importance of advocacy in navigating healthcare systems. He understood the difference between neglect and systemic barriers because I'd explained those differences to him, treating him as a partner in managing his health rather than a passive recipient of adult decisions. "And when Emma got hives from that snack at school," Jake continued, "Mom didn't know about it until the teacher called her. But she came to get Emma right away and took her to the doctor, even though it meant she had to leave work. She always puts us first, even when it costs her money she doesn't have." Emma, who had been coloring quietly throughout the morning's proceedings, looked up from her drawing when she heard her name. She raised her hand tentatively, as if she was asking permission to speak in class, and Judge Martinez nodded encouragingly. "My mom makes special food just for me," Emma said in her clear 5-year-old voice that carried across the courtroom with startling clarity. "She reads all the labels and asks questions at restaurants and makes sure I don't eat anything that will make me sick. Daddy forgets sometimes and gives me regular cookies, but Mom never forgets." The simple honesty of Emma's statement landed with more impact than hours of expert testimony could have achieved. Here was a child who understood the difference between consistent, knowledgeable care and occasional, well-intentioned but inadequate attention to her medical needs. Her casual mention of Michael's oversights revealed that his superior resources didn't necessarily translate into superior day-to-day management of her condition. Judge Martinez was taking notes rapidly, her expression shifting from neutral observation to active engagement with the testimony she was hearing. She asked Jake several follow-up questions about specific incidents that Rebecca Collins had cited as evidence of my negligence, and his answers revealed the complex context that had been stripped away in the original presentations. "When you say your mother called 5 different people about your inhaler prescription," Judge Martinez asked, "can you tell me more about what happened during those conversations?" Jake nodded seriously, clearly pleased to have an adult taking his explanations seriously. "First, she called Dr. Foster's office, but they said she had to call the pharmacy. Then she called the pharmacy, but they said she had to call the insurance company. Then she called the insurance company, but they said the prescription was too early to refill and she had to wait 3 more days. So then she called Dr. Foster's office again to see if they could give her samples. And they said they'd try, but they weren't sure if they had any." His step-by-step recounting of my attempts to resolve the prescription issue painted a completely different picture than Rebecca Collins's characterization of maternal neglect. What Jake was describing was a mother who understood healthcare, bureaucracy, and was willing to make multiple phone calls and exhaust every available option to ensure her son had the medication he needed. "And what did your mom do while she was waiting for the prescription to be resolved?" Judge Martinez continued. "She made me stay inside during recess so I wouldn't be around allergens," Jake replied without hesitation. "And she checked my breathing every few hours and made sure I always had water and that I didn't do anything that might trigger an attack. She even slept in my room for 2 nights to make sure I was okay." The courtroom was completely silent as Jake's testimony continued, revealing layer after layer of careful, knowledgeable medical management that had been invisible to everyone, except the children who'd benefited from it. Rebecca Collins had stopped shuffling through her papers and was staring at Jake with the expression of someone who was watching their carefully constructed case crumble in real time. Dr. Foster's letter, which Judge Martinez read aloud at Jake's request, provided professional validation for everything the children had been saying. The pediatrician's assessment was clear and unequivocal. Sarah Thompson was an exemplary parent who managed her children's complex medical needs with unusual skill and dedication. Both children's conditions were well controlled under her care. Their growth and development were normal, and their medical outcomes were better than average for children with similar diagnoses. The letter specifically addressed several of the incidents that Michael and his lawyer had cited as evidence of my inadequacies. Dr. Foster explained that delayed prescription refills were common problems in pediatric care that reflected insurance policies rather than parental negligence. She noted that food allergy reactions in school settings were virtually inevitable despite the best parental precautions, and that my response to Emma's incidents had been appropriate and effective. Most importantly, Dr. Foster's letter included her professional opinion that removing the children from my care would be detrimental to their medical management and overall well-being. She described the trust and communication we developed as essential elements in managing chronic conditions, and she warned that disrupting our established routines could lead to increased symptoms and decreased quality of life for both children. Jake had saved the most powerful piece of evidence for last. From the bottom of his manila envelope, he pulled out a folder that I recognized as his school portfolio, the collection of work samples and progress reports that teachers maintained throughout the academic year. He opened it carefully and removed a series of writing assignments that made my throat close with emotion when I realized what he'd chosen to share. We had to write about our heroes for a class project, Jake explained to Judge Martinez. Everyone else wrote about Superman or their dads or famous people, but I wrote about my mom because she's the person who takes care of me and Emma no matter what, even when it's really hard. He handed the judge his essay, written in the careful printing of a second grader who was still learning to form letters correctly, but had important things to say. Judge Martinez read it silently, but I could see her expression soften as she absorbed Jake's words. When she finished, she looked at him with obvious respect for the maturity and insight he'd demonstrated. "Jake," she said, "this is a very thoughtful essay about your mother. You've clearly put a lot of thought into what makes someone a good parent. Is there anything else you'd like me to know before I make my decision about where you and Emma will live?" Jake nodded solemnly, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this question. "I want to live with my mom because she knows us better than anyone else in the world. She knows that I need my inhaler before I exercise, and that Emma can't have dairy even in tiny amounts, and that we both get scared during thunderstorms. Dad's house is really nice, but Mom's apartment feels like home because she makes it feel safe for us." Emma raised her hand again, and when Judge Martinez acknowledged her, she added her own perspective with the straightforward honesty that 5-year-olds bring to complex situations. "I want to stay with Mommy because she makes special food just for me, and she knows how to make my tummy feel better when I'm sick. And she reads me stories with different voices for all the characters." The children's testimony had completely transformed the atmosphere in the courtroom. What had begun as a proceeding focused on financial resources and material advantages had become a conversation about the deeper elements of parenting that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or documented in photographs. Jake and Emma had articulated something that all the expert witnesses and legal arguments had missed: that effective parenting, especially for children with medical needs, required intimate knowledge, consistent attention, and the kind of love that showed up in daily actions rather than grand gestures. Judge Martinez announced a brief recess to review the new evidence that Jake had presented, and as the courtroom cleared, I found myself alone with my children for the first time all morning. Jake looked at me with an expression that mixed pride with uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure whether he'd done the right thing by speaking up. "Did I mess up, Mom?" he asked quietly, and I pulled him into a hug that felt like it might never end. "No, baby," I whispered into his hair. "You were perfect. You were so brave and so smart, and you told the truth when it mattered most." Emma climbed into my lap and wrapped her arms around my neck, and for a moment, the three of us just held each other while the weight of the morning's events settled around us. Whatever Judge Martinez decided, whatever happened next, I knew that my children understood something fundamental about our family that no lawyer or social worker could quantify. They knew they were loved, they knew they were safe, and they knew that I would fight for them no matter what obstacles we faced. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, Judge Martinez entered with a different energy than she'd shown earlier in the day. Her expression was thoughtful rather than neutral, and she spent several moments reviewing her notes before addressing the room. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the long-term implications of the decision she was about to make. This case has presented the court with compelling arguments on both sides, she began. But the testimony provided by Jake and Emma Thompson, along with the supporting documentation they've presented, has shed new light on the central question of what serves these children's best interests. She looked directly at me, and I felt something in my chest release for the first time in months. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Ms. Thompson has provided exemplary medical care for her children despite significant financial constraints. The perfect attendance records, combined with the pediatrician's assessment and the children's own testimony, indicate a level of health management that exceeds community standards for children with similar medical conditions. Rebecca Collins started to object, but Judge Martinez held up her hand to indicate that she wasn't finished speaking. Furthermore, the court notes that the children have demonstrated unusual maturity and insight regarding their own care, which suggests consistent education and involvement in health management decisions. This level of medical literacy is typically seen only in families where parents treat children as partners in their health care rather than passive recipients. She paused to look at Michael, whose confident expression had been replaced by something that looked like resignation mixed with embarrassment. While Mr. Thompson's resources and living situation offer certain advantages, the court must prioritize the children's demonstrated medical stability and emotional well-being over material considerations. The evidence suggests that disrupting their current care arrangements could have negative consequences for their health outcomes. Judge Martinez's final ruling granted me primary physical and legal custody of Jake and Emma, with modified visitation arrangements for Michael that included mandatory consultation with me regarding any medical decisions or changes to treatment protocols. She also ordered family counseling to help the children process the custody proceedings and ensure ongoing communication between both parents regarding their medical needs. As the gavel came down and the proceedings officially concluded, I felt a wave of relief so intense that it left me lightheaded. Jake squeezed my hand and Emma climbed back into my lap, both of them understanding that we would be staying together, that our little family had survived its greatest challenge intact. Michael left the courtroom without speaking to any of us, his expensive lawyer gathering her materials with the efficient disappointment of someone who'd lost a case she'd expected to win easily. But Jake called out to his father before he reached the door, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Dad," he said, "you can still come visit us whenever Mom says it's okay. We still love you, but we need to live where we feel safe." The generosity of spirit that my 8-year-old son showed in that moment, extending forgiveness and inclusion to the man who'd tried to take him away from me, reminded me why I'd fought so hard to protect him and his sister. Despite everything they'd witnessed and experienced, they still had open hearts and the capacity for love that hadn't been diminished by adult conflicts or legal battles. 6 months later, our life had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and new. We were still living in the same apartment in Moreno Valley, still managing on a budget that required careful planning and creative solutions. But the fear that had shadowed our daily existence was finally gone. I'd been promoted to a full-time position at Valley Medical Center, which provided better insurance coverage and enough financial stability to occasionally say yes when the children asked for small extras. Jake's asthma remained well controlled, and his perfect attendance streak had continued into 3rd grade. Emma had started kindergarten with confidence and enthusiasm, armed with the self-advocacy skills that would serve her well throughout her educational journey. Both children had grown stronger and more resilient through our shared challenges, developing empathy and resourcefulness that would benefit them throughout their lives. The custody battle had taught us all something important about the difference between material wealth and true security. We'd learned that love expressed through consistent action was more valuable than resources without emotional investment, that knowledge and dedication could overcome financial limitations, and that sometimes children understand justice more clearly than the adults who are supposed to protect them. Michael had initially struggled with the modified visitation arrangements, but over time he'd begun to appreciate the structure and communication requirements that had been put in place. His relationship with Jake and Emma was evolving into something healthier than it had been during our marriage, based on genuine interest in their well-being rather than control or possession. The perfect attendance awards that Jake had presented in court had become symbols of our family's resilience and determination. We'd framed them and hung them in our living room, not as trophies of legal victory, but as reminders of what was possible when love was backed up by knowledge, consistency, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right rather than what was easy. Looking back on that day in court, I realized that Jake's decision to speak up had changed more than just the legal outcome of our custody case. It had restored my faith in the possibility of justice, in the power of truth to emerge even in systems that seemed designed to favor wealth over worth. Most importantly, it had shown me that my children understood something fundamental about our family that no external observer could measure or quantify. They knew they were loved not because of what I could buy them, but because of how I showed up for them every single day, in small moments and big crises, with patience and creativity and the kind of fierce protectiveness that comes from understanding that being their mother was the most important job I would ever have. And in the end, that knowledge was powerful enough to overcome every obstacle that money and influence could put in our way. 3 years have passed since that transformative morning in Riverside County Family Court, and as I sit here watching Jake practice his presentation for the school science fair, while Emma carefully arranges her art supplies for tomorrow's kindergarten project, I'm struck by how profoundly our lives have changed while remaining fundamentally the same. We're still in the same 2-bedroom apartment in Moreno Valley, still living on a budget that requires creativity and careful planning. But the shadow of fear that once colored every decision has been replaced by something much more powerful. The unshakable knowledge that we belong together and that love backed by determination can overcome obstacles that once seemed impossible to navigate. Jake is now 11 years old, taller than I expected him to be at this age, with the same serious, dark eyes that captured Judge Martinez's attention 3 years ago, but now tempered by a confidence that comes from knowing his voice matters and his observations have value. His asthma remains well managed, and his perfect attendance streak has become something of a legend at Riverside Elementary, where teachers now use him as an example when talking to other families about the importance of consistent health management and school engagement. The science fair project he's working on tonight is about air quality and respiratory health, a topic he chose not because of his own condition, but because he wants to help other kids understand how environmental factors can affect breathing, and what simple steps families can take to create healthier home environments. Watching him research and prepare his presentation, I'm amazed by his sophisticated understanding of medical concepts that most adults struggle with, knowledge he's gained not through formal study, but through years of being treated as a partner in managing his own health rather than a passive recipient of adult decisions. Emma, now 8 and thriving in 2nd grade, has grown into a child whose confidence about her food allergies has become one of her defining characteristics rather than a limitation that holds her back. She reads ingredient labels with the thoroughness of a trained nutritionist, advocates for herself in social situations with remarkable diplomacy, and has become a resource for other children in her class who are learning to navigate their own dietary restrictions. Her teacher recently told me that Emma's matter-of-fact approach to her allergies has helped normalize differences for her entire class, creating a more inclusive environment where various needs are accommodated without drama or exclusion. The promotion I received 18 months ago to a supervisory position in the medical records department at Valley Medical Center has provided financial stability that allows us to make choices based on preference rather than pure necessity. Though, we remain mindful of the lessons we learned during our most challenging period. We've been able to move to a slightly larger apartment in the same complex, giving Jake and Emma their own bedrooms for the first time since our divorce. Spaces they've decorated with the same careful attention to detail that Jake brings to his school projects and Emma applies to her artistic endeavors. More importantly than the additional space, my new position has reconnected me with the direct patient care work that originally drew me to healthcare, as I now supervise a team of medical assistants and help train new employees in the kind of comprehensive patient advocacy that goes beyond simply processing paperwork. The irony isn't lost on me that the years I spent navigating complex healthcare systems as a parent with limited resources gave me insights into patient needs that have made me more effective in my professional role than I might have been without those experiences. The custody arrangement with Michael has evolved into something more functional and less contentious than either of us probably expected during those dark months of legal battles. His initial resistance to the court's communication requirements gradually gave way to genuine appreciation for the structure they provided. And he's developed a better understanding of Jake and Emma's daily medical needs through forced participation in care coordination. The children spend every other weekend with him now, but those visits include detailed preparation about medication schedules, dietary requirements, and emergency protocols that have eliminated the health incidents that once marked transitions between homes. Michael's house in Mission Viejo remains impressive by material standards, but Jake and Emma now view it as their father's space rather than a superior alternative to our life together. They've learned to appreciate different kinds of wealth. The abundance of resources Michael can provide versus the richness of relationships and experiences we've cultivated in our more modest circumstances. When they return from their weekends with him, they're usually full of stories about activities and outings, but they also consistently express relief to be back in the environment where they feel most understood and secure. The most significant change in our family dynamic has been the children's growing understanding of their own power to shape their circumstances and advocate for their needs. Jake's decision to speak up in court wasn't an isolated act of courage, but the beginning of a pattern of thoughtful self-advocacy that has served him well in school, medical settings, and social situations. He's learned that having a voice doesn't mean being confrontational or disrespectful, but it does mean speaking truth when truth matters and standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Emma has developed her own version of advocacy, skills, approaching challenging situations with a combination of directness and charm that helps adults understand her needs without feeling criticized or defensive. When a substitute teacher recently forgot about her dairy allergy during a class cooking activity, Emma calmly explained her situation and suggested alternatives with the kind of problem-solving initiative that impressed not just the teacher, but the parent volunteers who witnessed her mature handling of a potentially dangerous situation. Both children have become resources for other families dealing with medical challenges, often serving as informal mentors to younger kids who are learning to manage chronic conditions or navigate dietary restrictions. Jake has volunteered to help train incoming kindergartners who have asthma, teaching them how to recognize early symptoms and communicate their needs to teachers and school staff. Emma frequently offers to share allergy-safe snacks with classmates who have similar restrictions, turning what could be an isolating condition into an opportunity for connection and mutual support. The perfect attendance awards that changed everything in that courtroom have multiplied over the years, but they've also evolved in meaning for our family. What began as evidence of medical stability has become a symbol of resilience, determination, and the power of consistent effort to create extraordinary outcomes from ordinary circumstances. Jake's attendance record has inspired other children with chronic conditions to view their medical needs as manageable challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles, and teachers often point to his example when encouraging families to prioritize health management and school engagement. The community we've built in Moreno Valley has become one of the unexpected gifts of our post-divorce life, connecting us with families who understand the creative problem-solving required to provide rich, Experiences for children on limited budgets. Our neighbors have become an extended family of sorts, sharing resources, expertise, and support in ways that make all of our lives more stable and enjoyable. When Jake needed help with advanced math concepts that were beyond my abilities, Mr. Rodriguez from upstairs, a retired engineer, offered tutoring sessions that evolved into a weekly homework club for several children in our building. Emma's artistic talents have flourished through informal mentorship from Mrs. Kim, a professional graphic designer who lives in our complex and recognized Emma's potential during a community art fair we organized in the building's courtyard. These relationships have given both children access to knowledge and experiences that supplement their formal education, while reinforcing the lesson that wealth comes in many forms and that communities can provide opportunities that individual families might not be able to create alone. The healthcare advocacy skills I developed during our custody battle have opened unexpected professional opportunities, including consulting work with legal firms representing families in medical malpractice cases and serving on patient advocacy committees at area hospitals. These roles have allowed me to help other parents navigate the complex systems that once seemed so overwhelming, turning our family's challenges into expertise that benefits others facing similar situations. Most rewarding has been the opportunity to mentor other single mothers who are struggling with custody battles involving children with medical needs, helping them understand that perfect parenting isn't about having unlimited resources, but about consistent advocacy, creative problem solving, and the kind of love that shows up in daily actions rather than grand gestures. Many of these women have become close friends, creating a support network that provides both practical assistance and emotional encouragement during difficult times. Jake's interest in healthcare has evolved beyond personal necessity into genuine career curiosity, and he's begun talking about becoming a pediatric pulmonologist so he can help other children with breathing problems. His understanding of patient experience from the child's perspective, combined with his natural empathy and communication skills, suggests he could indeed excel in medical fields that require both technical knowledge and emotional intelligence. Watching him comfort younger children during medical appointments, explaining procedures in kid-friendly language, and offering reassurance based on his own experiences, I can envision the kind of compassionate healthcare provider he might become. Emma's artistic abilities have developed into sophisticated skills that go far beyond typical childhood creativity, and she's begun exploring ways to use art as a tool for education and advocacy. Her latest project involves creating illustrated guides for children with food allergies, combining her artistic talents with her lived experience to help other kids understand their conditions and feel less alone in managing dietary restrictions. The local children's hospital has expressed interest in featuring her work in their pediatric allergy clinic, potentially reaching hundreds of families who could benefit from her perspective. The legal victory that secured our family's stability has had ripple effects that extend far beyond our personal circumstances, contributing to broader conversations about how family courts evaluate parental fitness and whether financial resources should carry the weight they traditionally have in custody decisions. Jake's testimony, particularly his systematic presentation of evidence that contradicted adult assumptions about our situation, has been cited in legal journals discussing the importance of listening to children's voices in custody proceedings. The case has also influenced policy discussions about healthcare access and the ways that systemic barriers can be misinterpreted as parental negligence, leading to more nuanced approaches to evaluating medical care in families with limited resources. Dr. Foster has become an advocate for comprehensive assessment of health outcomes rather than surface-level examination of financial capabilities, using our case as an example of how effective medical management can occur across all economic levels when parents are properly educated and supported. Our story has been shared through various channels as an example of resilience and advocacy, but what matters most to me isn't the public recognition, but the private knowledge that we've built something meaningful from circumstances that could have destroyed us. The strength we discovered during our darkest period has become the foundation for a life that's rich in relationships, purpose, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've overcome challenges through character. rather than privilege. The apartment that once felt like a step down from our previous life now feels like home in ways that Michael's impressive house never did. Filled with memories of small victories, creative solutions, and the daily accumulation of love expressed through attention to detail and commitment to each other's well-being. Jake's corner where he builds increasingly complex engineering projects, Emma's art station where she creates works that now hang in local galleries, the kitchen table where we've solved countless homework problems and life challenges together. These spaces represent security that has nothing to do with square footage or property values. The financial stability we've achieved through my career advancement has allowed us to give back to the community that supported us during our most difficult period, contributing to the local food bank that helped us stretch our grocery budget, volunteering with the after-school program that provided safe care for the children when I was working multiple jobs, and supporting the legal aid clinic that helped me navigate the custody process when I couldn't afford private representation. These acts of service have reinforced for Jake and Emma the importance of using whatever advantages you have to help others facing similar challenges, teaching them that strength isn't just about overcoming adversity, but about reaching back to assist others who are still climbing the same mountains you've successfully navigated. They've both volunteered with programs that serve children with medical conditions, sharing their expertise and offering encouragement to families who are still learning to manage complex healthcare needs. Looking toward the future, I see possibilities that seemed impossible during those dark months when losing my children felt like an inevitable consequence of not having enough money to compete with Michael's resources. Jake is considering applying to specialized STEM programs that could accelerate his path toward medical school, while Emma is exploring art schools that could help her develop her talents into professional capabilities. Both paths require planning and resources, but they also build on foundations of resilience, advocacy, and creative problem-solving that our family developed through necessity and refined through practice. The most important lesson we've learned through our journey is that true security doesn't come from external circumstances, but from internal confidence in your ability to handle whatever challenges arise through knowledge, preparation, and mutual support. The perfect attendance awards that saved our family in that courtroom weren't just pieces of paper, but evidence of an approach to life that prioritizes consistency, responsibility, and the kind of love that shows up in daily actions rather than dramatic gestures. Tonight, as I help Jake prepare his science presentation and review Emma's art project, I'm struck by how naturally they've internalized the values that sustained us through our most difficult period. They approach challenges with confidence, seek help when they need it, advocate for themselves and others, and understand that success is measured not just in individual achievement, but in contribution to community well-being. The custody battle that once threatened to destroy our family ultimately made us stronger, more connected, and more purposeful than we might have become without facing that existential threat to everything we held dear. Jake's courage in speaking truth to power when it mattered most established a family culture where honesty, advocacy, and mutual support are valued above comfort or convenience. As we prepare for tomorrow's activities, Jake's science fair, Emma's art presentation, my quarterly review at work, I'm filled with gratitude for the journey that brought us to this place of stability and purpose. We've learned that love, expressed through consistent action, is more powerful than any material advantage, that children's voices carry wisdom that adults often miss, and that families can not only survive adversity, but emerge stronger, closer, and more committed to the values that truly matter. The perfect attendance awards hanging in our living room serve as daily reminders that extraordinary outcomes can emerge from ordinary dedication, that consistency matters more than perfection, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. In the end, that's what saved us. Not legal strategy or financial resources, but the simple truth spoken by a child who understood justice more clearly than the adults who were supposed to protect him. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.